In 1977, investigators discovered something impossible in the basement of Montreal's prestigious Allan Memorial Institute. Rooms designed not for healing, but for the complete erasure of human memory. Hidden in classified files for 20 years, this is the story of 80 unsuspecting psychiatric patients and the CIA-funded psychiatrist who systematically destroyed their minds in the name of national security. Before we dive into this disturbing case, make sure you're subscribed. We uncover these forgotten horrors every week, and this channel isn't for everyone. Only for those brave enough to learn what really happened when the CIA turned a respected hospital into a laboratory for human experimentation. What you're about to hear isn't fiction. These are the Montreal experiments, a documented program where patients seeking help for depression and anxiety were subjected to months of drug-induced comas, intensive electroshock therapy, and psychological torture. The architect of these horrors, Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron, one of the most respected psychiatrists of his era, secretly funded by the American Central Intelligence Agency. The year 1950 found the world in the grip of Cold War paranoia. McCarthyism swept through America, while the Soviet Union seemed to possess mysterious abilities to extract confessions from captured American prisoners. Reports emerged from Korean war camps describing American soldiers who appeared to have their personalities completely altered, confessing to crimes they never committed. At the heart of American fears was the concept of brainwashing, the idea that communist nations had developed techniques to completely reprogram human consciousness. The CIA, desperate to develop their own mind control capabilities, launched a series of classified programs. The most infamous would become known as MKUltra. In Montreal, Canada, the Allan Memorial Institute stood as a beacon of progressive psychiatric care. Founded in 1943 and affiliated with McGill University, the institute treated patients suffering from depression, anxiety, and various psychiatric conditions. The building itself was elegant, a converted mansion overlooking the St. Lawrence River, where patients could receive the most advanced treatments available. At the center of this story stands Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron, a Scottish-born psychiatrist who had already achieved international recognition. Cameron served as the first chairman of the World Psychiatric Association and had been a psychiatric evaluator at the Nuremberg trials. His credentials were impeccable, his reputation beyond reproach. Patients and colleagues alike viewed him as a brilliant innovator in the field of mental health. What they didn't know was that Cameron had developed a radical theory about psychiatric treatment. He believed that mental illness was caused by faulty patterns of thought and behavior that had become so deeply ingrained they could not be modified through traditional therapy. His solution was revolutionary and terrifying: completely erase a patient's existing personality and memories, then rebuild them from scratch. Cameron called this process psychic driving. Robert Logia's case demonstrates how Cameron's experiments specifically targeted vulnerable populations, including military veterans who had served their country with honor. A decorated World War II veteran, Logia had experienced what would today be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder following his service in the European theater. Military records show that Logia had served with distinction as a radio operator with Canadian forces during the liberation of Holland. He had witnessed intense combat and had been present during the discovery of concentration camps in the final months of the war. Like many veterans of his generation, he rarely spoke about these experiences, but occasionally suffered from nightmares and periods of anxiety. In 1961, 16 years after the war's end, Logia sought help at the Allan Memorial Institute for what he described to his family as nerves. At age 39, he was working as a successful insurance salesman, was married with 3 children, and by all external measures was living a productive and stable life. Cameron's intake evaluation, preserved in hospital records, shows that he immediately identified Logia as an ideal subject for his most intensive experimental protocols. The psychiatrist noted that the veteran's war experiences had created deep-seated personality disturbances that conventional therapy could not address. Only complete personality reconstruction, Cameron concluded, could free Laugier from the psychological burden of his military service. What followed was a systematic campaign to destroy every aspect of Laugier's identity and memory. Over the course of 4 months at the Allan Memorial Institute, he underwent 76 electroshock treatments, administered according to Cameron's intensified protocols. Medical equipment logs show that these treatments used electrical currents up to 6 times stronger than those employed in standard ECT procedures. The electroshock treatments were combined with what Cameron called regressive therapy, the use of powerful drugs to force patients into childlike states of dependency. Pharmaceutical records indicate that Laugier was given massive doses of LSD, often in combination with barbiturates and other psychoactive compounds. During these drug-induced states, nursing observations describe Laugier regressing to infantile behavior patterns. He lost bladder and bowel control, required feeding by hand, and would spend hours crying or making nonsensical sounds. Cameron's clinical notes celebrate these developments as evidence of successful personality regression that would allow for complete reconstruction. The most disturbing aspect of Laugier's treatment involved Cameron's attempts to erase his military service memories specifically. Using a combination of electroshock and psychic driving, the psychiatrist focused on eliminating what he viewed as the traumatic core of Laugier's personality, his experiences as a soldier. Audio recordings from Laugier's psychic driving sessions, preserved in legal files, reveal the calculated nature of this memory destruction. Cameron's voice can be heard on the tapes repeatedly stating, "You were never a soldier. The war is not real. Your military service never happened. You are not a veteran." These messages were played continuously during Laugier's drug-induced comas, sometimes for 12 hours at a stretch. The goal, according to Cameron's research notes, was to completely eliminate Laugier's identity as a veteran and replace it with a more manageable personality structure. The psychological cruelty of this approach becomes clear when viewed in historical context. Laugier's military service had been the defining experience of his young adulthood, a source of pride and identity that had helped him build a successful civilian life. Cameron's systematic destruction of these memories was tantamount to erasing the foundation of Laugier's adult identity. The physical toll of the treatments was equally devastating. Medical monitoring reports show that Laugier lost 30 pounds during his 4 months at the Allan Memorial Institute, developed chronic tremors from the intensive electroshock treatments, and showed signs of severe neurological damage. When Laugier finally left the hospital in late 1961, his family was confronted with a man they no longer recognized. His wife later testified that he seemed like a confused child in an adult's body, unable to remember basic facts about his life or family. Most heartbreakingly, he showed no recognition of his military service or the pride he had once taken in his contribution to the war effort. The practical consequences of Laugier's treatment were immediate and severe. He could no longer perform his job as an insurance salesman, as he lacked the cognitive abilities and interpersonal skills the position required. Simple tasks like balancing a checkbook or following directions became insurmountable challenges. His relationship with his children was perhaps most affected by Cameron's interventions. Before his treatment, Laugier had been an engaged and loving father who enjoyed teaching his sons about his wartime experiences and the importance of military service. After his release from the Allan Memorial Institute, he showed little interest in his children and seemed unable to form emotional connections with them. The financial impact on the Laugier family was catastrophic. With the primary breadwinner unable to work, the family quickly exhausted their savings and was forced to rely on government assistance. Medical bills from Laugier's treatment and subsequent care consumed what little resources remained. Perhaps most tragically, Laugier's condition continued to deteriorate in the years following his release from the Allan Memorial Institute. Family members reported that he suffered from chronic depression, frequent confusion, and what appeared to be early-onset dementia. He died in 1967 at the age of 45, just 6 years after entering Cameron's program. The autopsy report, later obtained by attorneys investigating Cameron's work, showed evidence of extensive brain damage consistent with repeated electrical trauma to neural tissue. The pathologist noted abnormal scarring in areas of the brain associated with memory formation and personality function. The physical infrastructure that enabled Cameron's experiments was as chilling as the procedures themselves. The Allan Memorial Institute's sleep rooms were located in the basement of the building, away from the main patient areas where families might observe the true nature of the treatments being administered. Architectural plans from the period, obtained through legal discovery, show that these rooms were specifically designed to facilitate psychological experimentation. Each room was soundproofed to prevent screams or other disturbing noises from being heard elsewhere in the building. The walls were painted in neutral colors to avoid providing any visual stimulation that might interfere with the psychological programming process. Hospital maintenance records reveal disturbing details about the equipment installed in these rooms. Each contained a hospital bed equipped with leather restraints to prevent patients from moving during their drug-induced comas. Speakers were mounted in the walls at head level, positioned to ensure that psychic driving messages could be delivered directly into patients' ears. The rooms also contained intravenous feeding equipment, catheter systems, and monitoring devices to keep patients alive during extended periods of unconsciousness. Electrical outlets were specially modified to accommodate the high power requirements of Cameron's electroshock equipment. Staff members who worked in these areas later described them in sworn testimony as resembling torture chambers more than medical facilities. Nurses reported that the rooms often smelled of human waste and disinfectant, as patients frequently lost control of bodily functions during their treatments. The psychological impact on staff members was significant. Several nurses who worked in the sleep rooms during the 1950s and 1960s later testified that they had requested transfers to other departments because they could not tolerate the conditions they witnessed. One former nurse, identified in court documents only as Nurse R, described finding patients who had been left unconscious in their own waste for days at a time. She testified that when she tried to provide basic hygiene care, she was told by supervisors that such interventions might interfere with the experimental protocols. Another staff member described the sound of the psychic driving recordings as like water torture, the same words and phrases repeated endlessly day and night. She reported that even staff members who worked briefly in these areas would sometimes find themselves unconsciously repeating the phrases they had heard. The isolation of these rooms also facilitated abuse by ensuring that there were no witnesses to the full extent of the treatments being administered. Patients' families were told that visits were not permitted during intensive therapy phases, leaving victims completely vulnerable to whatever procedures Cameron chose to implement. Hospital administrative records show that access to the sleep rooms was strictly controlled. Only Cameron and his most trusted associates were permitted to enter these areas, and detailed logs were kept of who entered and when. This level of security suggests that Cameron was aware of the controversial nature of his work and was taking steps to prevent unauthorized observation. The eventual exposure of conditions in the sleep rooms played a crucial role in public outrage over Cameron's experiments. When photographs and descriptions of these facilities were released during congressional hearings in the 1970s, they provided stark visual evidence of the institutional nature of the abuse that had occurred. Medical files from the Allan Memorial Institute reveal that Morrow underwent what Cameron termed de-patterning, a process designed to completely erase existing thought patterns. The procedure began with massive doses of electroconvulsive therapy, administered at intensities far beyond standard medical practice. Where normal ECT involved single treatments, Cameron administered multiple shocks in rapid succession, sometimes 3 times daily. Hospital records indicate that during these sessions, patients like Morrow received between 150 to 180 electroshocks over the course of their treatment, 6 times the maximum considered safe by medical standards of the time. The goal, according to Cameron's notes, was to reduce patients to a childlike state, where they would lose all memory of their previous lives. While Morrow endured the electroshock treatments, she was simultaneously administered powerful barbiturates and other drugs. Nursing logs from the period describe patients who appeared to enter vegetative states, unable to recognize family members or remember their own names. Some patients regressed to infantile behavior, requiring feeding and diaper changes. But electroshock was only the beginning of Cameron's protocol. The institute housed what staff referred to as sleep rooms, chambers where patients were kept in drug-induced comas for weeks or months at a time. Medical records show that Cameron used massive doses of barbiturates, chlorpromazine, and other psychiatric drugs to maintain these artificial comas. Some patients remained unconscious for up to 65 consecutive days. During these extended periods of unconsciousness, patients were subjected to psychic driving, the continuous repetition of recorded messages played through speakers or headphones. The messages, recorded by Cameron himself, were designed to break down the patient's existing personality structure. Some recordings contained negative statements about the patient's character, while others repeated simple phrases thousands of times. Dr. Cameron's own research notes, discovered in CIA files released in 1977, describe the intended effect of this treatment. He wrote that successful depatterning would result in patients losing all memory of their previous lives, their relationships, and even basic skills like reading and writing. They would become, in his words, completely clean slates, ready for reconstruction. The reality was even more devastating than Cameron's cold clinical description suggested. Nursing records from the Allan Memorial Institute paint a horrifying picture of the ward during this period. Staff members described patients who would wake from their induced comas unable to recognize their own children. Some had lost the ability to speak coherently or control basic bodily functions. Others displayed signs of severe neurological damage, including tremors, memory loss, and personality changes that would prove permanent. Linda MacDonald's case, documented in hospital files from 1963, exemplifies the devastating impact of Cameron's experiments. A mother of 5 children, MacDonald entered the institute seeking treatment for postpartum depression following the birth of her youngest child. Over the course of 86 days, she received 109 electroshock treatments and spent weeks in drug-induced comas while being subjected to psychic driving. When MacDonald finally left the Allan Memorial Institute, medical records indicate she had lost all memory of her previous life. She could not recognize her husband or children, had forgotten how to read, write, or perform basic tasks, and displayed the intellectual capacity of a young child. Her family was told these were unfortunate but unavoidable side effects of treating her severe depression. What they weren't told was that MacDonald had been an unwitting subject in a CIA-funded mind control experiment. The breakthrough in understanding the true nature of Cameron's work came not from medical investigators, but from journalists and government whistleblowers who began examining CIA documents in the mid-1970s. What they discovered revealed a systematic program of human experimentation that stretched far beyond Montreal. Declassified CIA documents show that Dr. Cameron received $69,000 between 1957 and 1964 to conduct his experiments at the Allan Memorial Institute. This funding came through a complex web of front organizations designed to hide the CIA's involvement. The money was channeled through the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, which presented itself as a legitimate research foundation, but was actually a CIA-controlled entity, the MKUltra network, a web of institutional abuse. The Allan Memorial Institute was not an isolated case, but rather one node in a vast network of research facilities conducting similar experiments across North America. CIA documents released through Freedom of Information Act requests reveal that MKUltra encompassed 149 separate sub-projects at universities, hospitals, prisons, and psychiatric institutions throughout the United States and Canada. At Stanford University, Dr. Leo Hollister conducted LSD experiments on psychiatric patients and prison inmates from 1961 to 1965. Hospital records from this period show that subjects were given doses of LSD up to 10 times stronger than those used in legitimate psychiatric research, often without their knowledge or consent. Some subjects were kept in drug-induced psychotic states for weeks at a time, while researchers observed their reactions. The scope of Stanford's involvement was revealed through internal university documents obtained during congressional investigations. These papers show that university administrators were fully aware of the CIA funding and had helped design cover stories to hide the agency's involvement from both subjects and oversight committees. Dr. Hollister's research protocols preserved in CIA files focused on developing techniques for interrogation and behavior modification. Subjects were subjected to combinations of LSD, sensory deprivation, and psychological manipulation designed to break down their resistance to questioning. The long-term psychological damage to participants was considered an acceptable price for advancing intelligence capabilities. At Harvard University, Dr. Henry Murray conducted psychological experiments on undergraduate students as part of MKUltra's personality assessment research. Beginning in 1959, Murray recruited students for what he described as studies of personality development and stress resistance. Participants were told they would be debating philosophical and ethical questions with graduate students. In reality, the experiments involved subjecting students to intense psychological abuse designed to attack their fundamental beliefs and values. Participants were strapped to chairs with electrodes monitoring their physiological responses, while they were subjected to hours of hostile questioning and personal attacks. One of Murray's subjects was Theodore Kaczynski, who later became known as the Unabomber. While it would be an oversimplification to attribute Kaczynski's later violence solely to his participation in Murray's experiments, psychological evaluations conducted decades later suggested that his experience as a test subject had contributed to his profound distrust of authority and technology. University records show that Murray's experiments continued for several years, with some subjects participating in multiple sessions over extended periods. The psychological impact on participants was significant, with several requiring counseling or psychiatric treatment after completing their involvement in the research. At the University of Oklahoma, Dr. Louis Jolyon West conducted LSD experiments on both psychiatric patients and prison inmates. Medical records from this period show that West administered massive doses of LSD to subjects, sometimes keeping them in psychotic states for months at a time. Some subjects died as a result of the treatments, though their deaths were officially attributed to their underlying psychiatric conditions. West's research focused on developing techniques for deprogramming individuals who had been subjected to communist brainwashing. The irony of using torture techniques to counter what were perceived as communist torture techniques was apparently lost on CIA administrators who funded his work. Prison records from the Oklahoma State Penitentiary show that inmates were offered reduced sentences or improved living conditions in exchange for participating in West's experiments. Many subjects were unaware that they were receiving experimental drugs or that their participation was part of a CIA-funded research program. The pharmaceutical connection, the scope of MKUltra's pharmaceutical experiments, extended far beyond individual researchers like Cameron and West. CIA documents reveal that the agency maintained relationships with major pharmaceutical companies, using their resources to develop and test experimental drugs on unwitting human subjects. Eli Lilly and Company provided the CIA with large quantities of LSD for use in MKUltra experiments, often without asking questions about how the drugs would be used. Internal company documents obtained through litigation show that Lilly executives were aware that their products were being used in human experimentation but chose not to investigate the details of these programs. Sandoz Pharmaceuticals, the Swiss company that had originally developed LSD, also maintained a relationship with CIA researchers. Company records show that Sandoz provided not only LSD but also experimental compounds that had never been tested on humans. These substances were distributed to MKUltra researchers with minimal safety information or guidelines for use. The relationship between pharmaceutical companies and MKUltra researchers created a system where experimental drugs could be tested on human subjects without the normal safeguards required for clinical trials. Subjects in CIA-funded experiments received compounds that would never have been approved for human use under normal regulatory procedures. Financial records from this period show that pharmaceutical companies received substantial payments from CIA front organizations for their cooperation in these research programs. These payments were disguised as consulting fees or research grants, but they effectively purchased the company's silence about the ultimate use of their products. International implications and Allied involvement. The reach of MKUltra extended beyond North American borders, with CIA researchers conducting experiments in cooperation with Allied intelligence agencies. British intelligence services provided subjects for some experiments, while research facilities in Europe and Australia participated in related programs. Declassified documents from the British Secret Intelligence Service show that British agents provided information about interrogation techniques developed through their own human experimentation programs. Some of these techniques were later incorporated into CIA training manuals and used in MKUltra research. The involvement of Allied intelligence agencies created an international network of human experimentation that operated largely outside normal diplomatic and legal channels. Subjects of these experiments included not only citizens of participating countries but also foreign nationals who had been captured or recruited for intelligence operations. Foreign ministry documents from several NATO countries reveal that diplomatic officials were aware of CIA experimental programs being conducted on their territory but chose not to intervene. This tacit approval allowed MKUltra researchers to operate with virtual impunity in multiple countries. The academic intelligence complex, the extensive involvement of prestigious universities in MKUltra research, revealed the existence of what critics termed an academic intelligence complex, a network of relationships between intelligence, agencies, and academic institutions that facilitated unethical research on human subjects. University financial records from the 1950s and 1960s show that CIA funding often represented a significant portion of research budgets for psychology and psychiatry departments. This financial dependence created strong incentives for academic researchers to cooperate with intelligence agencies, even when such cooperation violated ethical guidelines. Academic administrators often helped conceal the true source of research funding by accepting grants through front organizations or by allowing researchers to misrepresent the nature of their work to institutional review boards. This complicity at the highest levels of academic administration enabled systematic violations of research ethics. The involvement of respected academic institutions also provided legitimacy for MKUltra research. When CIA officials needed to justify their human experimentation programs to congressional oversight committees, they could point to the participation of prestigious universities as evidence that the research was scientifically valid and ethically appropriate. Faculty members who participated in MKUltra research often used their academic positions to recruit subjects from vulnerable populations. Students, psychiatric patients, and prison inmates were targeted. Specifically because their institutional dependence made them less likely to refuse participation or report abuse. Congressional investigations in the 1970s estimated that MKUltra programs affected tens of thousands of people, though the true number may never be known due to the systematic destruction of records. The victims included not only direct subjects of experiments but also family members who suffered secondary trauma from the abuse of their loved ones. CIA internal documents suggest that agency officials were aware that their research programs were causing permanent psychological and physical damage to subjects. Memos from this period discuss the need to limit exposure to avoid public relations problems that might arise if the extent of the damage became known. The demographic profile of MKUltra victims reveals a pattern of targeting vulnerable populations who were least likely to be believed if they reported abuse. Psychiatric patients, prisoners, minorities, and young people were disproportionately represented among experimental subjects. Medical records from institutions that participated in MKUltra research show that subjects often died or suffered permanent disability as a result of their participation. These casualties were typically attributed to their underlying conditions rather than to the experimental treatments they had received. Financial networks and money laundering. The financial infrastructure that supported MKUltra research was as sophisticated as the experimental programs themselves. CIA accountants created a complex network of front organizations, shell companies, and false grant programs to hide the agency's involvement in human experimentation. Banking records obtained through congressional investigations show that CIA funds were laundered through multiple accounts and organizations before reaching researchers like Cameron. This elaborate financial structure was designed to ensure that subjects and oversight committees could never trace their treatment back to intelligence agencies. The Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, which funded Cameron's work at the Allan Memorial Institute, was just one of dozens of front organizations created to channel CIA money to MKUltra researchers. Other entities included the Geschichte Fund for Medical Research, the Josiah Macy Jr. Foundation, and various university research centers. Financial audits conducted in the 1970s revealed that these front organizations had distributed millions of dollars to MKUltra researchers over the course of more than 2 decades. The true scale of CIA investment in human experimentation was far larger than had been previously understood. The sophisticated money laundering techniques developed for MKUltra would later be used in other CIA operations, including the funding of foreign political parties, paramilitary groups, and propaganda operations. The financial networks created for human experimentation programs thus contributed to a broader expansion of CIA capabilities for covert operations. Financial records indicate that Cameron's work was part of MKUltra, the CIA's broader program to develop mind control techniques. The agency had become convinced that Soviet and Chinese intelligence services had developed methods to completely reprogram human consciousness, and they were desperate to develop similar capabilities for their own use. Internal CIA memos from this period, released through Freedom of Information Act requests, reveal the agency's specific interest in Cameron's depatterning techniques. One document describes Cameron's work as particularly promising for developing methods to extract information from prisoners or reprogram captured agents. The scope of the Montreal experiments expanded dramatically once CIA funding began flowing to the Allan Memorial Institute. Hospital administrative records show that Cameron hired additional staff, expanded the sleep room facilities, and began accepting patients from across North America. Some patients were referred by other physicians unaware of the true nature of the treatments, while others were transferred from psychiatric facilities in the United States. Dr. Cameron's patient selection criteria, documented in his research protocols, reveal a calculated approach to finding suitable subjects for his experiments. He preferred patients with relatively minor psychiatric conditions, depression, anxiety, or marital problems, rather than severe mental illness. His reasoning, according to his notes, was that these patients had more stable personality structures to break down and rebuild. The experiments followed a consistent pattern that emerged from analysis of dozens of patient files. Upon admission, patients underwent extensive psychological testing and evaluation. Cameron and his staff compiled detailed profiles of each patient's personality, memories, and behavioral patterns. This information would later be used to measure the effectiveness of the depatterning process. Medical equipment records from the Allan Memorial Institute show that Cameron used a device called the Page-Russell electroshock machine, which delivered electrical currents significantly more powerful than standard ECT equipment. The machine could administer multiple shocks simultaneously, and Cameron routinely used settings far beyond manufacturer recommendations. During the electroshock phase, patients were also given powerful psychoactive drugs including LSD, PCP, and experimental compounds provided by pharmaceutical companies cooperating with the CIA. Drug administration logs indicate that some patients received LSD doses up to 100 times stronger than those used in legitimate psychedelic therapy research of the period. The combination of electroshock and psychoactive drugs was designed to create what Cameron termed differential amnesia, the ability to selectively erase specific memories while leaving others intact. His goal was to eliminate traumatic or problematic memories while preserving basic cognitive functions. In practice, the treatments often resulted in complete memory loss and severe brain damage. Once patients had been sufficiently depatterned, they were moved to the sleep rooms for the driving phase of treatment. Nursing schedules from this period show that the sleep rooms operated around the clock, with patients kept in drug-induced comas while being subjected to recorded messages. The messages themselves, preserved in Cameron's research files, were disturbing in their repetitive and undermining nature. Some recordings repeated simple phrases like, "You are a good wife and mother," thousands of times. Others contained negative messages designed to break down the patient's self-concept. "You are weak. You cannot remember. Your old life is gone." Audio equipment logs indicate that these messages were played continuously for weeks or months, often through headphones or speakers placed directly next to the patient's head. Some patients were subjected to this auditory bombardment for 16 hours per day, with only brief interruptions for medical monitoring. The physical conditions in the sleep rooms, documented in nursing reports from former staff members, were deplorable. Patients lay unconscious in their own waste, developing bed sores and infections from prolonged immobility. Some required feeding tubes or intravenous nutrition to keep them alive during extended periods of unconsciousness. Medical monitoring records show that several patients experienced serious complications during the sleep room phase. Some developed pneumonia, blood clots, or cardiovascular problems from prolonged bed rest. Others showed signs of brain damage from the combination of drugs and oxygen deprivation. Despite these serious complications, Cameron continued to expand his program throughout the early 1960s. Hospital records indicate that the Allan Memorial Institute treated approximately 80 patients using Cameron's experimental protocols between 1957 and 1964. The true number may have been higher, as some records were destroyed before the extent of the program became public. The first cracks in the secrecy surrounding Cameron's work appeared in the early 1970s, when former patients began speaking publicly about their experiences at the Allan Memorial Institute. Their accounts were initially dismissed as the fabrications of mentally ill individuals seeking financial compensation. However, persistent investigation by journalists and attorneys gradually revealed the truth. The breakthrough came in 1977 when the New York Times published a series of articles based on CIA documents obtained through Freedom of Information Act lawsuits. These documents, known as the Family Jewels, contained detailed accounts of illegal CIA activities, including the MKUltra program and Cameron's work in Montreal. Government documents released during this period revealed that the CIA had not only funded Cameron's experiments, but had actively participated in designing the research protocols. Agency personnel made regular visits to the Allan Memorial Institute to observe treatments and evaluate their potential applications for intelligence work. One particularly damaging document was a CIA evaluation report from 1963 that praised Cameron's DE patterning techniques as highly effective for producing complete amnesia in human subjects. The report noted that patients showed no memory of their previous lives and could be reconstructed with new personality patterns as desired. The document went on to describe potential applications for these techniques in intelligence operations. CIA analysts envisioned using Cameron's methods to reprogram captured enemy agents, extract information from prisoners, or create sleeper agents with artificially implanted personalities and missions. Financial records released during congressional investigations in the late 1970s showed that the CIA had provided Cameron with far more than the initially reported $69,000. Through various front organizations and funding channels, the agency had actually paid the Allan Memorial Institute over $500,000 between 1950 and 1965, equivalent to approximately $4 million in today's currency. The scope of Cameron's work was also far broader than initially understood. Research records indicate that he conducted experiments not only on psychiatric patients, but also on hospital staff, medical students, and volunteers who were unaware they were participating in CIA-sponsored research. Some subjects were given LSD without their knowledge, while others underwent experimental procedures that were described as routine medical treatments. Patient testimony collected during legal proceedings in the 1980s painted a devastating picture of the long-term consequences of Cameron's experiments. Many former patients never recovered their pre-treatment memories or personalities. Linda MacDonald, whose case was documented earlier, never regained the ability to recognize her children or remember her life before entering the Allan Memorial Institute. Medical evaluations conducted decades after the experiments showed that many survivors suffered from permanent neurological damage, including severe memory problems, personality disorders, and cognitive impairments. Some developed epilepsy as a result of the intensive electroshock treatments, while others experienced chronic pain and mobility problems from extended periods of forced immobility. The psychological impact on survivors was equally devastating. Many struggled with identity issues, unable to form stable relationships or maintain employment due to their fragmented memories and damaged personalities. Some experienced what psychiatrists described as existential terror, the constant fear that their current identity was artificial and could be erased again. Family members of Cameron's patients also suffered lasting trauma. Spouses described coming to visit their loved ones only to find that they no longer recognized them. Children grew up with parents who seemed like strangers, unable to remember their births, childhood milestones, or family traditions. The revelation of Cameron's work sparked investigations in both Canada and the United States. The Canadian government established a commission to investigate the Allan Memorial Institute experiments, while the U.S. Congress held hearings on CIA mind control programs. These investigations revealed that Cameron's work was part of a much larger network of CIA-sponsored research. The agency had funded similar experiments at universities, hospitals, and psychiatric institutions across North America. In total, MKUltra encompassed 149 separate research projects involving thousands of unwitting subjects. Some of the most disturbing revelations concerned the involvement of respected medical institutions and researchers. Major universities, including Harvard, Stanford, and Columbia, had participated in MKUltra projects. Pharmaceutical companies had provided experimental drugs, while prominent psychiatrists and psychologists had conducted unethical research on vulnerable populations. The CIA's own internal documents showed that agency officials were well aware of the illegal and unethical nature of these experiments. Memos from the period discussed the need to maintain plausible deniability, and to ensure that research subjects could not trace their treatment back to the CIA. One particularly damaging internal memo described the MKUltra program as a grave risk to the agency and noted that public exposure could result in severe embarrassment and legal liability. Despite these concerns, the program continued for more than 20 years. The human cost of these experiments was staggering. Congressional investigators estimated that MKUltra had affected tens of thousands of people, many of whom suffered permanent psychological and neurological damage. The true number of victims may never be known, as the CIA destroyed many relevant documents in 1973 when the program was officially terminated. When the full extent of the Montreal experiments and the broader MKUltra program became public in the late 1970s, both the American and Canadian governments faced an unprecedented crisis. The revelation that respected medical institutions had conducted torture disguised as treatment, funded by intelligence agencies, threatened to undermine public trust in both healthcare and government institutions. The initial government response was predictably defensive. CIA Director William Colby, testifying before Congress in 1975, acknowledged that the agency had conducted some activities that were clearly wrong and quite possibly illegal. However, he insisted that these programs had been terminated and that appropriate safeguards were now in place. Canadian officials were even more evasive, Despite mounting evidence of government involvement in funding Cameron's research, Health Minister Marc Lalonde initially denied any federal knowledge of the experiments. This position became increasingly difficult to maintain as documents emerged showing that multiple Canadian government agencies had been aware of and involved in the research. The legal battles that followed would drag on for decades. Survivors of Cameron's experiments filed lawsuits against the CIA, the Canadian government, McGill University, and the Allan Memorial Institute. These cases faced significant obstacles, as many relevant documents had been destroyed and potential witnesses had died or refused to testify. Legal records from the 1980s show that government attorneys employed every possible tactic to avoid responsibility for the experiments. They argued that too much time had passed for valid claims, that patients had consented to experimental treatments, and that the research had been conducted by independent contractors rather than government employees. The most cynical defense involved blaming the victims themselves. Government lawyers argued that because the plaintiffs had been psychiatric patients, their testimony about abuse was inherently unreliable. This strategy was particularly cruel given that the patients' mental conditions had been deliberately worsened by the very experiments they were seeking to challenge. Despite these obstacles, several cases eventually reached settlements. In 1988, the CIA agreed to pay $750,000 to the families of 9 MKUltra victims, though the agency did not admit wrongdoing. The Canadian government eventually established a $100,000 compensation program for victims of Cameron's experiments, though critics argued this amount was wholly inadequate given the scale of the damage inflicted. The institutional response to the revelations was equally inadequate. McGill University, despite clear evidence that it had housed and facilitated Cameron's research, initially refused to acknowledge any responsibility. The university's administration claimed that Cameron had acted independently and that they had been unaware of the true nature of his work. This position became increasingly untenable as evidence emerged showing that university officials had been briefed on Cameron's research and had actively helped recruit patients for his experiments. Internal university documents showed that administrators had been aware of the CIA funding and had helped structure contracts to hide the agency's involvement. The medical profession's response was similarly disappointing. Despite clear evidence that Cameron and his colleagues had violated fundamental principles of medical ethics, professional medical associations largely declined to sanction the researchers involved. The American Psychiatric Association, of which Cameron had been a prominent member, issued only mild criticisms of his work and took no disciplinary action. This reluctance to hold medical professionals accountable sent a troubling message about the profession's commitment to ethical standards. Many medical ethicists argued that Cameron should have been stripped of his professional credentials and that institutions involved in the research should have faced significant sanctions. The broader intelligence community also largely escaped accountability for MKUltra. While some CIA officials retired early or faced internal disciplinary measures, none were criminally prosecuted for their role in the program. The agency's official position was that the experiments had been conducted during a different era when different ethical standards applied. This historical relativism ignored the fact that ethical guidelines for human experimentation had been well established since the Nuremberg trials of the 1940s. The Nuremberg Code had explicitly prohibited medical experiments on human subjects without their informed consent, yet Cameron and his CIA handlers had routinely violated these principles. The destruction of records also limited accountability efforts. In 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of most MKUltra documents, claiming they were no longer needed. This systematic destruction of evidence made it impossible to fully document the scope of the program or identify all of its victims. Congressional investigators estimated that approximately 20,000 pages of MKUltra documents were destroyed before the program's existence became public. The surviving documents, totaling about 8,000 pages, provided only a partial picture of the research conducted and its human cost. The long-term consequences of this failure to achieve accountability are still visible today. Many survivors of Cameron's experiments died without ever receiving adequate compensation or acknowledgement of the harm they had suffered. Today, their families continue to struggle with the psychological and financial consequences of the abuse. More broadly, the inadequate response to MKUltra set a troubling precedent for government accountability in intelligence operations. The message seemed to be that illegal and unethical activities would be tolerated as long as they were conducted in the name of national security and could be kept secret long enough for statutes of limitations to expire. The legacy of the Montreal experiments and the broader MKUltra program continues to resonate in contemporary discussions about medical ethics, government accountability, and the limits of national security activities. More than 4 decades after these revelations, many of the fundamental issues they raised remain unresolved. Recent declassification efforts have revealed that the scope of CIA mind control research was even broader than initially understood. Documents released in the 2000s showed that the agency continued conducting psychological research on human subjects well into the 1980s, despite congressional prohibitions and public assurances that such programs had been terminated. These revelations have raised troubling questions about what other unethical research programs may still be classified or ongoing. Government watchdog organizations have identified numerous areas where intelligence agencies continue to conduct research that raises ethical concerns, including studies of interrogation techniques, behavioral modification, and pharmacological manipulation of human consciousness. The medical and scientific communities have also grappled with the legacy of unethical research like Cameron's experiments. New institutional review board procedures and informed consent requirements were established partly in response to MKUltra revelations, but critics argue that these safeguards remain inadequate. Contemporary examples of questionable research practices suggest that the fundamental problems that enabled Cameron's work have not been fully addressed. Pharmaceutical companies continue to conduct research in developing countries with less stringent ethical oversight, while military and intelligence agencies fund psychological research that operates in ethical gray areas. The psychiatric profession in particular has struggled to reconcile its history of abuse with its contemporary emphasis on patient rights and ethical treatment. While modern psychiatric practice is generally far more humane than Cameron's brutal methods, concerns remain about the use of involuntary treatment, experimental procedures, and the influence of pharmaceutical companies on clinical practice. Legal questions also persist about government accountability for historical abuses. While some victims of MKUltra received limited compensation, the vast majority of those affected by unethical government research programs have never received acknowledgement or restitution. This pattern has been repeated in other cases involving government abuse of vulnerable populations. The destruction of records remains a particular point of concern. Despite laws requiring the preservation of government documents, intelligence agencies continue to destroy potentially embarrassing or incriminating records. This practice makes it difficult to fully understand the scope of past abuses and to prevent similar violations in the future. International implications of the Montreal experiments continue to affect diplomatic relations between the United States and its allies. The revelation that the CIA had conducted illegal experiments on Canadian citizens strained US-Canada relations for years and raised questions about American respect for national sovereignty and international law. Similar concerns have emerged in other contexts where US intelligence agencies have operated abroad. Reports of CIA activities in European countries, Latin America, and other regions have often included allegations of human rights abuses and violations of local laws, continuing patterns established during the MKUltra era. The technological capabilities available to modern intelligence agencies also raise new concerns about the potential for abuse. Advances in neuroscience, pharmacology, and information technology have created possibilities for manipulating human consciousness that Cameron could never have imagined. Contemporary reports of targeted individuals who claim to be subjected to psychological harassment by government agencies echo some of the paranoid concerns of the Cold War era. While many of these claims lack credible evidence, the historical reality of programs like MKUltra makes it difficult to dismiss them entirely. The question of informed consent in government-funded research remains contentious. While institutional review boards now require detailed consent procedures, critics argue that research subjects are often not fully informed about potential risks or about the ultimate applications of the research they participate in. Military and intelligence funding of academic research has also raised ongoing concerns. Universities continue to accept funding from agencies like the CIA and the Department of Defense for research that may have applications in intelligence operations or warfare. The ethical implications of such relationships remain debated within the academic community. The Montreal experiments serve as a stark reminder of what can happen when institutional safeguards fail and when the pursuit of national security objectives overrides basic ethical principles. The fact that respected medical professionals, prestigious universities, and democratic governments all participated in or enabled these abuses demonstrates the vulnerability of ethical standards during periods of perceived crisis. Perhaps most troubling is the evidence that lessons from these revelations have not been fully learned. Each new scandal involving unethical government research or medical abuse is treated as an isolated incident rather than part of a larger pattern that requires systematic reform. The survivors of Cameron's experiments, now elderly or deceased, represent not just individual victims of abuse but symbols of a broader failure to protect vulnerable populations from exploitation by powerful institutions. Their suffering serves as a warning about the need for constant vigilance in protecting human rights, even when, especially when, that protection conflicts with institutional interests. As we continue to grapple with questions about the appropriate limits of government power, the ethics of medical research, and the balance between security and human rights, the Montreal experiments remain a powerful reminder of the human cost of crossing ethical boundaries in the pursuit of institutional goals. The question that haunts us today is not just what happened at the Allan Memorial Institute between 1957 and 1964, but what similar abuses might be happening now, hidden behind classifications and institutional secrecy, waiting to be discovered by future investigators. What do you think? Have we learned enough from these historical abuses to prevent similar violations today? Are there adequate safeguards in place to protect vulnerable populations from exploitation by powerful institutions? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story disturbed you as much as it did us, make sure you're subscribed and hit the notification bell. Next week, we'll be investigating another dark chapter in institutional abuse that governments tried to keep hidden for decades. Until then, stay vigilant, stay questioning, and remember, the truth always finds a way to surface, no matter how deeply it's buried.